Aloha, spooky nerds, and welcome to Talking Strange, a paranormal pop culture show with the Den of Geek Network. I am your host, journalist, author, researcher of all things weird, Aaron Sagers. You can also catch me on Paranormal Caught on Camera on Travel Channel and Discovery Plus, and I'm also host of the new series on Netflix, 28 Days Haunted, and very happy with how that show's been doing so far. Very excited that it's been charting globally in the top 10. So I hope you get a chance to check that out. Now, as we record this, we are still in the midst of spooky season, and Halloween is just a few days away. But right after Halloween is another holiday, another festivity that has similarities in origin, but is obviously a very different thing. It is Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. It's taking place November 1st and 2nd, and it is not Mexican Halloween. It is not that. Rather, it's a rich celebration with significance and an array of concepts, and I want to talk about it with a person that I've not been able to chat with before, but he is the author of Llewellyn's Little Book of the Day of the Dead. He was born in Mexico City in 1989, and he has followed the Wiccan path since he was 13 years old. He writes about spirituality, magic, minority religions, myths, witchcraft, focusing on Mexico and Latin America. He's also an international columnist for The Wild Hunt, which is a daily news site for pagans, heathens, Wiccans, witches, and polytheists. And his name is Jaime Gironés, and here he is. Jaime, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for the invite. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and I have your book with me right here, the Little Book of the Day of the Dead, and it says it's a little book, but it contains a lot of information about this holiday, and I'm going to ask you some questions, but I also want to encourage anyone that is watching this live to throw their questions into the chat, and we'll get to those as well. But let me start with asking simply, can you talk a little bit about the purpose of Dia de los Muertos? What is, especially as someone that is a native of Mexico City, where it's celebrated quite a bit, talk a little bit about the purpose and significance of the Day of the Dead.
Of course. Well, the main purpose of the Day of the Dead is to honor our loved ones who are no longer with us, but they are still in spirit. So for a certain time in the year, around this time of the year, we take a moment and some space to remember those who are dead or those who are deceased, and we honor their lives, their memories. We remember them, and out of these love and remembrance, we share with them what we have in our life. We share with them our abundance, our wins of the year, and we share them through our offerings.
Yeah.
So mainly through an altar, or also called ofrenda, we give them thanks and we honor their lives, and we also share our bounty, or food, or water with them.
Okay. And yes, in a few minutes, I do want to get to some of the concepts like the ofrenda, the calaveras de azúcar. But before I get to that, I wanted the Day of the Dead, de los Muertos, Dia de los Muertos has origins in Mesoamerica and connections with the Mayans and Aztecs as well, right?
It has, yes. It's not that the celebration by itself is ancient and has and our ancestors in Mesoamerica used to celebrate the Day of the Dead. It's like that's not true, but the origins of the celebrations do come from those times, from how how the Mesoamerican people used to see death as part of life, and how they see the relationship with death, and how they used to bury their loved ones with offerings or with items that were important to them, or how they used to see deities of death and the link between life and death. And also, it has its origins on how in the indigenous communities, especially in the center of Mexico and South, um, look at the whole cycle of the maize or the corn, the agricultural cycle. The maize is usually harvested at this time of the year. So for a lot of indigenous communities in this part of the country, this is a time where the harvest is shared with your loved ones, and that includes also the deceased loved ones, your ancestors. And besides sharing the harvest with them, is also a way of saying thank you to these ancestors and deities and loved ones for the blessings that made the harvest possible. And this cycle is divided in two halves. And so the year has two halves. The first half is where the rain season starts around early May. The counterpart in the Catholic celebrations is the Cross Feast or Fiesta de la Santa Cruz. And it also has like mixed Catholic symbols with indigenous symbols, but it's basically the time of the year where the rainy season starts. So they ask the ancestors their blessing for the seeds that they're gonna plant, and to have a successful harvest. And the counterpart at the other part of the year, it's the day of the dead when the harvest happens. And this harvest, as I shared, is celebrated, shared with your loved ones, and also we give thanks because these harvests happen because of them.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. So you mentioned the Fiesta de la Santa Cruz in May, and Dia de los Muertos is connected to sort of a harvest festival, and in that way, it has similarities to Celtic and Druid festivities such as Samhain, and along with that, something we saw in those other cultures is that when as Catholicism and the Roman Catholic Church started spreading into other lands, they brought with it these notions of All Saints Day and then All Souls Day, and they merged it with these festivals, these folk festivals that were already existing. That's kind of similar with what happened here as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. The Spanish came into Mexico and brought with them these ideas of All Saints Day and All Souls Day and merged it with some of the practices that were already happening with the indigenous people.
Yeah, exactly. So when the Catholic came here, they also brought festivities or celebrations that also had European pagan beliefs origins. So when they came here, the Catholic festivities like the All Saints, All Souls, had elements that were already in the indigenous or from Mesoamerican origins. For example, the flowers in the altars, or the sweet smell of the copal or resin that is burned as offering or for cleansings. Those elements were brought into the Catholic festivities. And later on, around mid 20th century, a lot of political and academic cultural personalities um, raised the question of like what does being Mexican meant, or what does being Mexican means, and what they wanted to define what is it to be Mexican, and like the nationalism of being Mexican. And when doing that, they looked backward to our origins and to Mesoamerican cultures. And with a lot of romanticism, they brought the idea of what these elements meant, and they formed, or they helped forming, a lot of what we know today about the Day of the Dead, or how we celebrate it. One important thing to note, though, is that the Day of the Dead is a very diverse celebration. You can find very different ways on how it's celebrated in the north part of Mexico, or in the south part, or even in other parts of Latin America, or in the US, where there is the Latino or Hispanic communities. And different indigenous communities celebrate it, and in different ways. Some for a whole month, first just others just for a few days, and with different activities and ways of celebrating. The most common part of it is the altar, but yeah, I wanted to note that the the origins come from our Mesoamerican ancestors. Then there was this influence with when the Spanish and Catholicism came, but it is a celebration that has been evolutioning and growing through time, and through this time, and even today, it's not a specific defined way of celebrating. There's no specific way of celebrating, but it has common elements that you can find.
Yeah, I was fascinated about that when I was looking at your book because, you know, what does it mean to be Mexican? It's not just one thing. Mexican
Right.
people are not, monolithic, right? So in different parts of the country, there are different practices or ways to celebrate the Day of the Dead. I wanted you to just mention a couple of those because you talk about the cleaning of bones in one region, Dance of the Devil in another region. Can you just give us a couple examples of the ways that other people throughout Mexico are celebrating this day?
Sure. So, for example, in the state of Michoacan, there's a whole ritual in a lake, um, where the people, before the Day of the Dead, the night before, lit lights, and there's a whole ritual and dancing around the lake, and they visit the graves as well. Um, Visiting the graves is like a common item or activity you can find in different groups, but like in a contrasting way. In the state of Campeche, the Pomuch people, Mayan Pomuch people, they unbury the bones of their dead loved ones once a year around this time. So the way for them to celebrate the Day of the Dead is, they, I think the word in English is exonerate, when
Exhume, exhume, like dig it
exhume.
up, right?
Sorry, yeah,
No, it's okay.
sorry. So yeah, they take from the earth the bones, and they clean them, and they clean them with a brush, and it's actually for them very res- um, a ritual with a lot of respect and love, which others might find weird and very strange to like grab the bones of your dead loved ones. But for them, it's an act of love. And once a year, they take the bones and they clean them with a brush. They also change a white cloth of flowers that they use to wrap the bones around and to store the bones. And for them, if they don't clean the bones, it in their beliefs, their ancestors or wouldn't be happy or wouldn't be okay. So for them, it's an act of love of every year taking the bones, brushing them, cleaning them, and then putting them back on Earth. And in that region, I think that if like the law had to be created or modified around that tradition, because in other parts of the country or the world it's not legal to take the bones out of the graveyard. So yeah, like those are two quick examples of very like different ways of celebrating.
Yeah, it actually sounds quite beautiful when you think about it. It doesn't sound strange at all. Or maybe, just because you're not familiar with something or it's not what your culture does doesn't make it automatically strange because another culture does it. So it actually sounds quite beautiful. And also just let me state my great appreciation for you for doing this interview in English because my Spanish is so limited. So I'm appreciative for you for speaking my language during this talk when I should really be speaking your language. But the I I want to speak a little bit about the evolution of this festivity because it does continue to evolve. It seems like based on what you talk about in your book that there have been changes with the celebration, even modern day changes, and one of the things I'm going to mention is specifically in 2016 in I believe it was Mexico City. Well, there was a James Bond movie where James Bond is parading around this Day of the Dead festival and parade, and everybody's dressed up. That didn't actually exist before the James Bond movie, right?
Right, yeah, it was not a thing. It didn't exist. And it started happening because of the movie. And now every year we have the parade, and like everyone's like happy and excited about it. I think this year is this weekend on Saturday 29th. And yeah, and like it now, you can hear now a lot of excitement about the parade and going to the Day of the Dead parade, and it looks like an ancient activity or thing, but it's not. It happened because of a movie.
That I found that so funny because I've unfortunately never been to Mexico during Day of the Dead. I've always wanted to, and even before that movie, and then I saw the film. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I guess that's an example of pop culture having a good impact on a festival and on a holiday. What are some things that other people, up here, your neighbors to the north in America, what are some things that we get wrong about Dia de los Muertos, things that we seem to misunderstand?
Uh, I would say the first thing is that you mentioned it at the introduction, but it's not the Mexican Halloween. In Mexico, we are influenced a lot by American culture, as well as American culture is influenced by uh, Latino or Hispanic population that lives there. So both festivities or celebrations sometimes are mixed up or they overlap, and they happen at the same time of the year. And sometimes the line between them is a bit difficult to distinguish. But although there are similar elements, they are different. And um, the Day of the Dead at the end is a spiritual activity. Even for those who do not recognize them as religious or spiritual, um, at the end is an act of um, love and respect to your past and to your ancestors, and taking a time to remember them and to honor them and honor their lives and the memories you have of them. And so it's a time when we think of the past, when we think of our loved ones, when we share what we have lived this year, our winds are abundant with them. So, for example, in the parade, you can find people dressing up as skulls, or like the Katrina, which is like the lady with a skull and a big hat. But it's not at the same as like in Halloween, that you're dressing up like to scare people, or for a party. There are certain elements, as I said, that overlap. For example, just as in the American culture, how do you say when children ask for Halloween? Like they ask for candy and knock on doors.
Well, I was going to mention that we say trick or treating, but you have
Right.
what, pedir calaverita?
Yeah, so we do have a similar thing, which is pedir calaverita, which translates to request, ask for. Calaverita would be like little skull. And it's actually like the same, like children knock on door and ask for their calaverita. So there are certain elements that are very similar, and but the main part of the Day of the Dead is honoring your ancestors. It's not about like the spooky part of Halloween and dressing up.
Yeah, both kind of overlap and coexist. I mean, you mentioned, you would celebrate Halloween and you would celebrate trick or treating or pedir calaverita, but also there's the Day of the Dead, the next 2 days.
Yeah,
The
and you can find, sorry,
No, please.
and you can see all around the city how both festivities or celebrations overlap, or match or mingle together, because you can find sugar skulls from the Day of the Dead, or the papel picado, the cut paper. Like you can find Day of the Dead decorations, and at the same time, Halloween decorations at the same place. You can see pumpkins, you can see the ghosts, and like throughout the city, you can see these two festivities and these two cultures mingling with each other.
That's great. I want to talk a little bit about the actual some of the concepts and the ways that the Day of the Dead is celebrated, and we can talk about Mexico City, but some of the core ideas, and if you can walk through take us on a journey through a couple of these concepts, such as the ofrenda, the calaveras de azúcar, the pan de muerto, going to the cemeteries, the flowers, just kind of uh, tell us a little bit about each of those that you can think of and what the significance that they hold.
Of course. Um, so yes, the most common concepts or way of celebrating, I would say they are the ofrenda or altar. Uh, these are spaces that are set up usually at one's home so to celebrate and honor your their loved ones, which I'll explain a bit more in detail in a bit. The other will be visiting graveyards or visiting where your loved ones' remains are, and also leaving their flowers, or sometimes even people sing or dance there and celebrate like on site their dead loved ones. And before I explain both, and especially the altar, I want to explain that the Day of the Dead is a celebration that happens in different levels. One is an individual level, when you as a person, individual, and even when people are not religious or spiritual, they think of their loved ones, they gather pictures, they ask for their families, do you have a picture of my aunt because I don't have one? Also on a family level, when they have these gatherings or set up an altar in their family home. But on an individual level, a lot of introspection, a lot of even talking or praying to your dead loved ones, and if you live alone, your own altar. Family level, um, during this time of year, either you're gathering pictures or you're talking about your dead loved ones a lot, or as a family, you set up an altar at your home, or you visit the graveyards of your ancestors. But there's another level, which is like as a community. The Day of the Dead also happens on a community level, and for me, that's like the most interesting part, because you can find Day of the Dead altars in public transportation stations. You can find Day of the Dead altars in libraries or even hospitals. And some maybe with a theme. For example, a library may do a Day of the Dead altar dedicated to to writers who are dead, or talking about musicians, music school may create a Day of the Dead altar for musicians that are dead, right? And or also you can find just like a generic Day of the Dead altar, but even in government institutions or in the street, you can see Day of the Dead altars. And I just went to um, psychiatric hospital this week because of a family situation, and it was very interesting for me that like right in the middle of the hospital there was a Day of the Dead altar. And like I found it interesting because in that medical context they may not speak about spirituality or ancestors or loved ones, but still they do set the Day of the altar, and the altar is there.
Yeah. And
um,
and let me interrupt you just for one moment to clarify something. So when you're talking about these altars in other locations, in a library or a psychiatric hospital or government facilities, you can essentially you can also honor people that you are not strictly related to. It could be you could go to these locations and express love and honor toward and respect towards people you feel a connection to that you're not actually related to.
right. So in these altars that I mentioned, for example, in hospitals or public institutions, what I understand is they have more like a decorational purpose. Like it's the Day of the Dead, and we have to set up something. And when it has more ritual or spiritual activity of setting up the altar, would be more on an individual and family level. But you can also find places or moments where it is a community activity, and when the altar set up by the community, not precisely for your loved ones, but for dead um, for the dead ones that don't have people um, uh, for them like to be prayed
Sure.
for. Um, in 2017, we had a very strong earthquake in Mexico City, and it was around September 19 and September 7, two earthquakes. And on the second one, September 19th, a lot of buildings fell down, and there was a lot of like damage, and a lot of people died. And one thing that I remember the most is that a month later, and a half, 1 month and a half later, um, around this time of the year, the time of the Day of the Dead, outside of these places where buildings collapsed, um, the neighbors, people that work or that walked around those places, set up an altar outside the collapsed buildings or where people died. So either on the sidewalk or just like um, next to a wall that remained from the damaged building. And like it could be like people who knew some of that uh, died there, or it could be like just neighbors, or you as someone who were touched by the news and just went there and left a candle, left some flowers, and as a way of honoring their lives, lighting a candle for to guide their journey. to remember them, to honor them, and that was a community ritual activity effort that had like deep meaning, even when it was not for your ancestors and your dead loved ones.
Yeah, that's quite lovely, a way of like celebrating even and honoring people that as a community were lost. And of course there are the other, we associate the sugar skulls with this as well. Is there, and then pan de muerto, the food and drink is very much a part of this. And talk about the importance and significance of those. Is it just to have a sweet treat, or some bread, or what is the importance of these items?
Sure. To reply that one, I wanted to go back to your actual question of the altar, and I'll go to those elements. And so, as I mentioned, and you were asking more detail about I think the most common activities in the Day of the Dead in general are visiting graveyards and the altar, setting up the ofrenda at your home. And sometimes those are linked, like some people visit the graveyards and then sprinkle flower petals of the cempasúchil, or the Mexican marigold, from the graves of their loved ones to the door of their home. And this is to guide them, for them to know where to go, and go to the ofrenda or the altar. And in the graveyards, some people just go and are silent, others pray, others talk to the loved ones, others dance, others sing music. That depends on the person and also the community. And the ofrenda or the altar, it's basically a place at your home where the whole celebration happens. And setting up the ofrenda is an ritual on its own. You first gather pictures of your loved ones, dead loved ones, and part of it may trigger memories, may trigger conversations with your family about your history, about your dead loved ones, and talking and laughing about their lives. And that's also a part of the celebration, the remembering and honoring their lives. And so gathering the pictures, because the pictures on the offering are important, and they represent your dead loved one who you are honoring. And through on the altar, throughout these pictures, there are other elements like water, and this is not only as this spiritual universal symbol of water of life, but also as a gift for them, or as a offering up for them, as they may be thirsty after their journey back to your home, and for them to also drink before they go back and return. And the other would be candles to light their ways, to light their path, as in a general spiritual sense, but also light their way towards your altar and back home. Salt as a symbol of earth, and a very important part of the altar is the food. So you can find traditional dishes and actual cooked real food on the altars. And some people also do put fake food out of plastic for different reasons. You may have pets and you don't want them to be eating on your altar or something like that. But there are some elements that are both as decoration and as an offering, and also as this part of edible offering your altar, like the sugar skull. The sugar skulls represent both death in general, but also the deceased. And some people like to put a skull per loved one, like a tiny skull for a child that died, and then a big skull for your dad, or others like setting up big sugar skulls, a big huge sugar skull at top, like representing death, and then tiny ones below. And the Pan de Muerto, or Bed of the Dead, is there are different types around Mexico, but it basically represents the body of the dead, and also the four cardinal points, because it's a round size and it has four bones made of bread pointing to each cardinal point, and it's also used as an offering. And both items, sugar skulls and the bread, the pan de muerto, you can find them in altars and are placed as offering in the altar, but you can also go buy and eat for yourself or give as a gift to people.
And it's worth mentioning as well that in Jaime's book, the little book of the Day of the Dead, he does include some recipes on how to make the pan de muerto and some sugar skulls. Lots of interesting practical information in there as well. Now, the calaveras, we know the sugar skulls, the calaveras de azúcar, but there's also the literary calaveras, the poems about death. And then there's also, you talk about drawing the representations of death. And I found this to be just a really, again, some information that I wasn't quite aware of, but it kind of, it has significance in a larger global community as well. People do this to kind of confront their fears of death, and perhaps become sort of more familiar with the idea of death, almost treating death as an inescapable element, and maybe even kind of like a friend.
So, good question. I think that as a Mexican culture, we have a very special, or I would say different, relationship with death. And it's not that we are not afraid of death. Like, even I am at like certain moments of life. It's not that we don't go through grief. Of course, as any human, we go through our grieving process, but we do see death differently than other cultures, and I see that in the way that we talk. Like certain phrases when we refer as someone died instead of like that person died. There are phrases that would be like colgó los tenis. He hung his sneakers, or the skinny one came to take him, like la flaca vino por él. The skinny one came to take him. There are certain ways that we talk about death where we, first of all, personalize death, but also we give it a bit of humor, a way of laughing about death. I personally see that as a way that we, like, something that we did in order to confront death, and that happened through time because of these also elements and origins and our history, but that the result being us having a lasting relationship with death and personalizing that. And another example would be the way we refer to death as figure, sometimes maybe deity, sometimes even personification of the process of death. But some people do not, may say, he died, she died, they died, or death came for them. They may say the white one came and took them. La Blanca, or like La Flaca, the skinny one, or the La Huesura, which would be like the bone,
Mrs. Bones,
made out of, yeah, Mrs. Bones would be.
Doña Huesos, or is that it, or is that?
Yeah, exactly. That would be it. So we personalize it and we laugh at it, and it's something that it's. I think it's not. It's something about our way of seeing life, or something about our culture that we do not make ourselves conscious of it. But when writing my book, I wanted, besides explaining what Day of the Dead is and how, like, the origins, a bit of the background, and how we celebrate it and how I celebrate it. I wanted also for the book to be an inspiration for people around the globe who may not be from Latin or Hispanic or Mexican origins, but for them to know what they can get from the Day of the Dead, what inspiration they can receive from it. And that's for me the main point of my book. And the exercises that you mentioned that I added in my book, for example, name dead or draw dead, is a way for me of giving or trying to give a bit of this relationship that I see we have with death, and to use this celebration as a way of confronting that aspect of life.
And the names, like some of the names that audiences in the US might recognize are like La Llorona, who also has connections to other urban legends. But the names for death, La Calva, La Flaca, you mentioned, La Santa Muerte. But there's also this character of Katrina, and she's, if I remember, she's kind of a fairly new introduction, like the 20th century. Can you explain who Katrina is and her importance within Day That Did? You mentioned that people will sometimes dress up as her, but who is she? What's her purpose?
Of course, so La Catrina is a drawing or image figure that was created by Jose Guadalupe Posada, and these artists created out of symbols of death, and the skull, and like the, how do you pronounce it, scythe?
Oh yeah, yeah, like a scythe. Yeah.
Out of like these traditional old symbols of death, it was he draw a figure of a woman, but she's a skull, and she's very elegant with a big hat and fancy clothes of that time, and it started as a satirical or ironic way through drawing of criticizing the high society of the time, that uh, they were like very sorry, I forgot the word, but it was a way of making fun of the fancy people of the time.
Right.
So, but the Katrina became like one of our national symbols, I guess, or part of the Day of the Dead as well. And you can find that image of like a lady, which is a skull, but dressed up like in the parade or in decorations of the Day of the Dead. And you were asking something in before about the Calaveras literary writings, so which are related as well to these. The Calavera means skull. So I talked about the sugar skulls, but another meaning that has calavera is a literary text that is uh, a text in rhythm where usually the death is subject, is part of the story, but it's also, you're also making fun of someone. And also Calavera started as a political and social satires, or being critical about what was like what's happening. But these are texts, sometimes short, sometimes long, that you can find in newspapers or even in schools, that people write making fun about something. And when I was a child, for example, in primary school, and every year one of my homeworks was to create write a calavera. So I would write about maybe the a teacher or the head of the school, and like the death is a subject and a character in the story, but also the teacher, and you laugh about death, and you also laugh about the person you are writing about.
And you mentioned in your book, I was just trying to find it really quickly, that the literature that kind of ties, well, yeah, Diego uh Rivera painted La Catrina, Octavio Paz, and poems, and well, there's the mural by Frida Kahlo, and then Octavio Paz wrote. I found this just because I live in New York City. The word death, translated, his poem is that the word death is not pronounced in New York, in Paris, in London, because it burns the lips. The Mexican, in contrast, is familiar with death, jokes about it, caresses it, sleeps with it, celebrates it. It is one of his favorite toys and his most permanent love. That's great. That was from 1950, Octavio Paz. So that's an example of a literary calavera.
Well, not exactly. That's more like a very, well, a phrase that I love from Octavio Paz, and that is an example of our relationship with death. And a calavera would be more with rhymes,
Okay,
and
more of a
like
poem.
more of a poem, and where I would say, I don't know, like the skinny one came from Aaron, while he was recording his podcast, and um, she was scared, like she yelled or screamed because she was scared when, I don't know, like she looked at him. I don't know, like that's a very rough
I love it.
example. Imagine that rhyming, but like it's just like a story of how they would come from someone, and like you would usually include like elements of that personality or person you're talking about, and
Right.
exaggerate them and laugh at them. Which it wasn't like, it was my example was rough, and I and bad, but like you would make fun of someone. I'm talking about dead.
Yeah. No, I liked it. I appreciate you doing that on the spot. That was good. It
No,
was
it
way
was
better than
horrible,
I could do.
and it didn't rhyme. But yeah.
But and then when people don the masks, and you kind of mentioned this at the beginning. I'm going to get to this idea in a minute, but specifically when people paint their face or don the mask, part of it is to find the playfulness in death, to kind of confront the scariness of death, or is there a connection with sort of the Celtic tradition of during Samhain, like where they would wear masks? It was to pass by unnoticed from other spirits, the not nice spirits. They would wear the masks to avoid detection from some of those spirits or paint their faces. What's sort of the significance of donning the mask, wearing the mask during Day of the Dead?
So I think the face painting or masks are more like a result of the mingling relationship between the Day of the Dead and Halloween, that of the Day of the Dead itself. And part of this living tradition, evolving tradition that we were speaking about, like the parade, they're not very common to be like part of the main Day of the Day celebration. It's not like you say like paint your face to set up a Day of the Day altar, for example. But face like the face paint of the Katrina may be now a way for a Mexican girl to ask for a calaverita, instead of like uh, dressing up with a custom of, I don't know, a ghost, like using
Right.
some um, of her tradition culture, but for something that is now more mingled. It's not about the Day of the Dead. It's more like part of this Halloween, Day of the Dead time of the year.
Well, along with that mingling, the in the US, you see a lot of imagery that evokes Day of the Dead, and you see it's ever present. It's not just November 1st and 2nd. We see it all the time when we're encountering Mexican culture in the United States, it seems like. And I happen to love it. And I happen to appreciate the colorful skulls. I appreciate the imagery. And I think that it's a very good thing when we embrace other cultures. However, this is also a spiritual celebration, and there is a difference between cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation. And you speak about this in the book, and I wanted to get you to talk about it right now a little bit about how people can appreciate and love Dia de los Muertos without appropriating it.
Okay, that's a great question and a very hot topic. So, first, a disclaimer: my idea of where cultural appropriation starts and where cultural inspiration begins may not be the same as for others. There's a fine line, and it's my understanding that it sometimes depends on your own personal opinion of it. But I do include at the first part of the book a section about it. And what I say basically is, for me, at the end, depends on the purpose of what you're doing. Um, at the end, I wrote a book about the Day of the Dead and how you can celebrate it. But throughout my book, I offer ways for anyone, even if they're, regardless of their origin, how they could celebrate it. First of all, because death is a universal human experience. We all have dead loved ones. We all have ancestors. So honoring our ancestors is a universal um, activity or universal ritual. And you
Right.
don't have to be Mexican to honor your ancestors or your dead loved ones or remember their lives. Um, but I do include explanations on why the elements are uh, like why we have certain elements and what their meanings are, and then how you could, if you're inspired by the Day of the Dead, like the meaning you can get from it. So an example, the cempasúchil, or the Mexican marigold flower, is a very important symbol of the Day of the Dead. And mainly it is because it is harvested at this time of the year. It has a very orange yellow color and a very sweet smell. So it's used to because of the color and the smell, and because it is harvested at this time of the year, so it's very abundant. It is used to guide the path and decorate the altar, or you can find it everywhere. And one of our longest avenues in Mexico City, Reforma, it's decorated with cempasúchil flowers all the way, so you can find it everywhere. But when I talk about the cempasúchil flower and what it represents, light and life, and the sweet smell to guide your ancestors, and how we set up on the altar. I do not mean for other people to uh, uh, to literally use cempasúchil flowers or to look for cempasúchil flowers that they probably may not be able to find in some parts of the world, but to understand the general idea that if you want to honor your ancestors and your dead loved ones, you can look for flowers that have a sweet smell, um, and a bright color, and that they are harvested or abundant at that time of the year, at that part of the world the people live in. So, using those, understanding the meaning behind it, you can use those elements and adapt it to your context, inspired by the Day of the Dead, but towards your own personal context, religious, spiritual, or regional where you live. And so, replying to your question, and after this long example, I think the importance when we want to see the line between appropriation or inspiration would be the understanding the meaning behind things and the
Right.
purpose of why you're doing things. So the Katrina is at the end an art, Mexican symbol. So if you want to paint, face paint your child with a Katrina or a skull face and with colorful symbols, um, like my question would be, what's the meaning behind it, and how do you phrase it to your children? Is it like, first of all, do not say this is from Mexican Halloween, explain that it's from Day of the Dead, but also maybe touch on the subject of death, like you're painting a skull on your child, and maybe it's a nice moment to have a conversation about death at that time or your dead loved ones. And that's another rough example of like the purpose of meaning of doing things, but also when setting up an altar, is it for you and your dead loved ones, or is it just like posting on Instagram? Um, and I think the third part, or bonus, because I only mentioned two, is that to understand it's a community, and a community celebration, a group celebration. It's not only on individual and family level. So I think the best way for you, if you are not of Mexican heritage, Latino, or you don't live in Mexico, like the best way of honoring or celebrating the Day of the Dead first would be being respectful of the Latino Mexican communities that live near you, and listen how they celebrate the Day of the Dead and how much you can participate, help with those, and also being maybe honest and congruent. Congruent is a word, yes. That if you're celebrating a Mexican festivity, also being respectful to the Mexican culture and Mexican people that live near you as well. But at the end, honoring your dead loved ones is a universal thing. And there are different celebrations all around the world for the dead, not only Day of the Dead. And a lot have similar items as well because of Catholicism. But these are for your inspiration on how to look at death, the concept of death in your life, and and the opportunity to take a moment in the whole year to think about death and ponder death in general and your dead loved ones. Think about your dead loved ones and honor them. And the elements of the celebration have their meaning, have their origins, and the why behind. And if you understand those meanings and those origins, you may find something that is more applicable to your context.
And I want to, I mean, before I let you go, I want to ask, because you are Wiccan and you write about other religions, and you write about paganism and polytheism and spirituality. And I am curious about how you merge your Wiccan beliefs with Day of the Dead, and how, you know, you combine these kind of, there are certainly similarities, but there's also differences. How you kind of combine these two things.
Good question. So I tried in the ritual aspect, I try to separate them. So I first celebrate Samhain or Samhain, and then I also celebrate the Day of the Dead. In the meantime, as they happen around the same time of the year, you may find like elements of both in my own personal altar or even in my house, maybe decorations. Um, but I see it, and also in like some other Wiccan or pagan groups, you may find if you go to a Samhain or Samhain ritual, you can see like the jack-o'-lanterns, the pumpkins, but also cempasúchil flowers and sugar skulls. Like you may find similar elements, although as I've seen that we usually try to separate them. And there are elements in the ritual that may be similar at the end in honoring your the deceased, your dead loved ones, and that may happen in ritual, and that both have similarities. Um, Replying, that's how like I treat them or celebrate them, but how it has influenced, how one has influenced the other. I think that a general or common view or looking at the Day of the Dead is that it's a time where they visit us. And I think because of my beliefs, that I see this time of year when the veil between the worlds is thinner. And I now believe that it's not that they visit us, it's that they've always been here. But now that the veil is thinner, we are able to feel them more closely, see them more closely. And so I think that's how it has influenced me both and beliefs.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. And you do mention that part of the specific, the Day of the Dead celebration is also saying goodbye to the dead at the end of the festival. And uh, I want you to address that a little bit. It's not just about bringing them in, it's also kind of saying goodbye to them again for another year.
Yeah, of course. Well, the Day of the Day happens once a year. For some, a day, a few days, November 1st and November 2nd. In other parts of Mexico, in different communities, happens for a whole month. But it's a certain moment of the year, and it has a start and and an end. And when you're setting up the altar, you're usually like welcoming your uh, dead loved ones. Others do a more formal ritual on how to welcome them. For others, just like setting up the altar and putting the pictures is the ritual, and you're welcoming them. But like the altar cannot stay there the whole year. Like just like the Christmas tree just happens for a moment of the year. At some point, you have to set the altar down, pick everything up, cleaning. So there's a time of the celebration. It also changes. For some people wait, like, I don't know, a few days after, a week, but at some point you have to say goodbye and you have to dismantle the altar. And a part of the celebration and the ritualistic part of the celebration is to say goodbye again, to pray for them, for their paths back home or back where they came from, and saying goodbye again. So I see it as also like a grieving exercise or way of saying goodbye. Like, you welcome them, you talked with them, you shared with them, but at some point, you have to say goodbye again, and that's part of the celebration, because the celebration at the end is that life and death are linked to each other, and one cannot live without the other. And at the beginning of the year, we honor the loved ones and ask their blessing, and the rainy season starts, and then the harvest happens, and we thank them. Those counterparts, as well as life and death, are linked, and in this celebration, it's not the exception. It has to end at some point, and we have to say goodbye.
And Jaime, I know that you contribute to the Wild Hunt, which is the daily news site for pagans, heathens, Wiccans, witches, and polytheists. In addition to that, in addition to the Wild Hunt, how can people follow you and support your work?
Thank you. In addition to that, well, I would say with my book, which they can find at Llewellyn.com and at their favorite local bookstores, or in online famous bookstores as well. And I think that would be the best way of support, but also any kind words and messages are welcome, and people can contact me at mostly Twitter and Instagram. And my Instagram is Magical with double M and CK. And the Twitter is my name and last name, Jaime Gironés, all together.
And the book is, of course, sorry, there's some sirens outside New York City right now as I'm wrapping this up, but the book is Llewellyn's Little Book of the Day of the Dead. The author is Jaime Gironés, and I appreciate you, my friend, for your time. And I hope that you have a lovely Day of the Dead coming up this next week. And until next time, thank you so much, Jaime, for your time. And until next time, I want to say to everyone out there that's watching and listening, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.